Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Jean Mizutani at Include NYC, a New York City organization that works with families that have children and youth with disabilities. Today's topic is accessibility in New York City schools. What do you do when your child's needs don't fit into the organized mold of special and general education choices as presented by the school system? This is one of our series of live streams that occur on the third Thursday of each month. We will keep it to under 1 hour. We're going to have a chat box, so if you have a question, please feel free to chat us. We'll do our best to answer. We have also prepared a wonderful packet of digital handouts that you registered online. You should have gotten it, and we'll be referring to those as we go through our conversation. This will be an interesting conversation because our guests are parent activists. One brings unique, deep experience, and the other, the perspective of a parent just entering the school-age system. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us, Nicole.
Thank you.
Could you please give us a little background, and would you mind introducing yourself again, Rebecca, because I'm so poor with names.
I'm Rebecca Kostyuchenko. It's a very long name. Doesn't need to be pronounced correctly. I am the parent of a 6th grader, and she is in middle school in Brooklyn, and she has a wheelchair, a scooter, a walker, lots of different equipment that requires accessibility for her in school. And we've had a very unique, interesting journey through the public school system.
So I can see how you got started. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, my name is Nicole Mead. I have a son who just turned 5 years old. He's currently in pre-K. We're in the process of applying to kindergarten for him. And he has a very rare neurogenetic disorder that he has multiple disabilities. We're in the process of applying for kindergarten for him in the turning 5 process.
And that's exactly where Rebecca started too, correct?
Yes.
Right, so I can see how you got your start. I do see you as an accessibility advocate. Tell us a little more about your story.
Well, we started with an IEP when she was 18 months old, before she even had a diagnosis, and then went through EI, CPSE, as many people do, and then we're moving on to the turning 5, which is when we entered the, formal educational system, as I like to call it. And we were told that our daughter could not go to our local zone school because they were not accessible. They did not have an elevator. And we then turned to a private school, and then the Shared Path to Success came out.
I'm curious, what did the Department of Education offer you as an alternative since the local school wasn't available according to them?
We were offered an ICT spot 45 minutes from our home. Still in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn is a big place, so it was in another corner of Brooklyn. Which would have forced our daughter out of our community, away from all her friends, and put an extra hour and a half of transport into the day of a child who, my daughter has a neuromuscular disease that, as one of its side effects, has a huge amount of fatigue and tons of therapy that's required.
It's the last thing you'd want to do. So this was 6 or 7 years ago, is that right?
Let's see, 7 years ago.
Okay, so almost 7 years have passed. What difference are you finding now, Nicole?
So we are still unsure in our particular situation of where my son is going to get a recommendation, but I imagine that he will not be recommended. I'm quite certain he will be recommended to be zoned to his local school. We're not sure where the recommendation is going to be, but we are looking at a variety of schools across the city that will potentially meet his needs.
Okay, and I'm sure you're going to find that, by the way. It is challenging, but it is amazing that the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 25 years ago. How much progress have we actually made since then?
I'm going to keep my answer to New York City schools.
Good idea.
Because that's a big question.
Right.
But I would say almost nothing.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, there's been recent investigations into the New York City public school system in terms of accessibility, and at this point 83% of the schools in New York City are not accessible, and they are building new schools and rehabbing facilities that are becoming schools, and we are allowing charter schools to open constantly that are not accessible.
But isn't there a rising awareness?
Awareness, yes.
Well, that's not good enough, but awareness is the
Yes.
first step, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So let's talk about this a little bit. What is accessibility?
It's a lot of things.
It is a lot of things. Start wherever you like.
Well, clearly it's the physical, which is the way I just discussed it, because the ADA is very much focused on physicality. But then we also have IDEA, which involves accessibility and inclusion. And there's an article that's included in the packet which
Yes.
talks about what is inclusion, and it talks about the idea that sometimes you will be in it, and again, leaving it specifically to schools, sometimes inclusion will be better met for your child, even if they need accessibility, in a school that is not ADA compliant, because inclusion is so much more than just physical. It's how the teachers include you, it's how the student includes you, it's how the staff includes you, and it's how your community includes you, and how your education is accommodated for you in the classroom, not just in the physical building.
So you're saying that some non-accessible schools have better inclusive practices than accessible schools? This is shocking.
Well, if you think of how few accessible schools there are, the odds would
the
actually
odds
be
would
that you
support
might
that.
find it somewhere else.
Oh, gosh. Okay. What barriers are there? I mean, we're aware of the physical barriers, but you've just said that it's more than that. It's an attitude, it's a philosophy, or a practice. Share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, I think as a son, for someone who is going through the process of the Turning 5 process and looking at a large variety of schools, my son does have physical disabilities. He can climb stairs. He needs support when he's climbing stairs. He's slow when he's climbing stairs. It's tiring for him to climb stairs, but it's possible. So for us, it's a factor that we look at, but it's certainly not the factor that we look at, because to us, what is most important is that his academic needs are met, but also very important that he is included socially, and that he understands that he is part of a community of gen ed peers, and a community that reflects his community at large, a school that is able to do differentiation well for him. He uses assistive technology in the form of an alternative communication device. It's very important for us. Maybe the most important thing to us is that his communication needs are supported. So we'll choose communication over an ADA compliant school. Absolutely. But I don't feel that we should have to. I feel like both
That's
should
right.
be in place, and this is really where the issue comes in.
That is terrific insight. And just before we started, we were talking about private schools, which are never near your home. So even if a family feels there's no alternative, let me look for a private school. If you really want to have community membership and genuine inclusion, you want to be in your neighborhood. This was the beginning of your journey.
Yes.
What were you going to say, Rebecca?
Well, I was just going to talk to the point of, she mentioned that her son can go up the stairs even though it really tires him. And that is actually something that is possible for my daughter sometimes. So I just wanted to speak to that for children who are not capable of doing that, and about looking outside of ADA buildings for those children as well. One thing that I think is really important to know about New York City is that many of the elementary schools are voting and polling places,
Right.
which means that the first floor of many inaccessible schools are accessible. And in elementary school, you are in one classroom for most of the day with your peers. Most elementary schools do not send kids to different floors for different classes, etc.
Right.
So it's really, really possible to find an accessible situation for your child in what is called an inaccessible school by the DOE. And it is also possible to ask for that, and it is possible to get that. And I just want people to be aware of that and not think that what we're saying maybe isn't applicable to a child who has a 300-pound wheelchair, because it actually is.
Okay, but you're specifying this is particularly possible, shall we say, for the younger children?
Yes.
The younger children.
Yeah, and perhaps some middle schools and high schools as well, which, we can discuss about how you figure all this out and find all that out. But just that, I just think that the idea is that there are possibilities beyond the labels that are put on schools as being barrier-free, which is, the DOE
Right.
has categories of labels that they put on schools. So they have barrier-free, functionally accessible, inaccessible, and it's just a matter of sort of looking beyond that. And it's not just for a kid who maybe could do the stairs sometimes. It's also for kids who really, truly should be in barrier-free, but maybe that more inclusive, better fitting school is one that could work for them anyway, even if it's not.
Okay, this is very interesting because I think a lot of parents that have children that they know need an accessible building will look specifically for the accessible schools. So
Yes.
this means they're overlooking a lot of potential placements that might be better
Yes,
with more inclusive
I
practices.
think so.
That is amazing. Now, you mentioned earlier about the shared path, so this is probably a good opportunity to talk about that. Around 2010 or so, the New York City Department of Education launched full-scale special education reform. At that point in time, we referred to it as reform, but eventually that morphed into a shared path, and there was much more language around access. And what it basically said was that children with disabilities should attend to the maximum extent possible the same school they would have attended if they didn't have a disability, probably the same school that their sister or brother and neighbors attended. So this opened the door for you.
Yes, it did. I don't know, I don't believe, I mean, who knows what went on behind closed doors in passing this, but I don't think that they were thinking about children in wheelchairs when they opened this reform, which I think is sort of the sense that I get a lot of what's happening at DOE is like, it's just not in their radar, their sphere of thought, like the kids in wheelchairs, they're just not thinking about them. But I will say that, I grabbed onto it and
Right.
knocked on the door of our school, and I will give, in the summer, between first and second grade for my daughter, and said, I think we can come here now, right?
Right.
And she needed to go. She really needed it. We needed it, and we needed to be in our community. We need to be close to home. And the principal said yes. And there was this fuzzy gray area where my daughter could pull herself up the steps if she had to, but she'd be so tired at the top. I wasn't sure she'd learn anything. And we were put into a second floor classroom.
After all that.
Yeah.
Why would children that use wheelchairs or have other mobility challenges have been overlooked like this when we're talking about shared access?
I ask myself that question all the time in many situations. But I believe that there is a lesser incidence of this than a lot
Right.
of other different types of disabilities. And that's sort of what we're talking about, right? Like this is, sometimes when for example, when I was just in the middle school choice process and I would go to school and say, have you ever had a child with a wheelchair attend this school before?
Right.
I felt like I came to believe my daughter is a unicorn. It's like,
And yet she's not.
And yet she's
Yes,
not.
exactly.
So I think the less access there is, the less children go in the schools, the less people
Right.
see them, the less they
The
make
less precedent,
accommodations,
the less- exactly.
and it's just like a big snowball.
Oh, so now that you've heard Rebecca say that you shouldn't overlook a school just because they don't call themselves accessible, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I agree, and I don't think, I think for us, it's something that we, like I said, we just looked at as one of the things that to look at in a big, because specifically our son has more than multiple learning disabilities, but I mean, I think as multiple disabilities, I mean, I think we have to look at a variety of components, but I think even if your child has physical, just a physical disability, there still is a lot of other factors that go into making their education an inclusive environment, not just physical accommodations. But certainly we, in terms of choosing a school and making sure that he has all of the things that Rebecca was looking for when her daughter was going through this process of turning 5. We're looking for the same things. We want him to be an important a member of his community. We don't want to send the message that he's too much of anything to be included in his community. And, you know, just because we live in New York City and not in a small town that has one school where they're forced to make inclusion work,
Right.
ideally, it shouldn't be that just because we live here that he is separated from his community, because that's where it would work better for him. And I think it's really important that parents, when they're looking at turning 5 process or looking at any kind of school choice process, that they have that on their radar, that it's not just about getting, you know, ticking off the box of what the DOE has told them they need for their child. I mean, to really have a sort of a critical thing, to sort of have a critical thinking about it. And if your physical therapist is the one that's recommending that they have an accessible school, you know, really talk to the physical therapist about that. Is that something that they strongly believe needs to be the case? And can there be accommodations that can be made? And, you know, so.
Now this leads to a very interesting question that we were discussing earlier. Should that be placed on the IEP?
I say no.
That's a very interesting perspective.
Because, and to be honest with you, I don't know every situation that label on an IEP internally at the DOE, what that means in every single corner of the DOE. But in my mind, that is immediately accepting that categorization and that category of schools. And so while you may think that your child will have their best choice in a barrier-free school at the end of the day, if that's sort of where you think it's going to go, I would still say don't accept that label, even if that's where they end up.
Don't limit yourself.
Don't limit yourself. Exactly.
So this is why, now you know why I call you parent advocates. Earlier we talked about approaching a school that doesn't call itself accessible, knowing that for the younger children, the first floor is accessible. I say for the younger children because the kindergarten or first grade class doesn't require moving about the school the way it does when you're a little bit older.
In my daughter's 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, we're all in a not barrier-free school, and the classroom was just on the first floor. After 2nd grade.
Yeah, I think there was a little more to it than that.
Yes, but I mean, I'm just saying, like, it worked fine. Most children don't move around that much until middle school.
Right. So I love the message, don't limit yourself. Look and think. I really think that is amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness gracious. Tell me a little more about what's happening now. I've heard that 83% of New York City schools are not accessible.
Yes. And there continue to be choices made that promote continued inaccessibility. So, one of the articles there in this packet is a picture of my daughter and myself in the New York Times. The U.S. Attorney General, or an article about us, currently has an open investigation with New York City schools. We weren't in one of the schools listed in their report, but we were interviewed by the U.S. Attorney General. Our circumstances became aware to them during our 2nd grade year, that I was going to school, or my husband, or a family friend, multiple times a day to carry my daughter up the steps. Because when she was put into that 2nd grade class, I was so glad to get her in the door of the school.
Right.
I wanted that for her so badly that I wasn't about to say, oh, we can't go to school here because she's on the 2nd floor. And I also didn't know the administration at the school that well at that point. They were just getting to know me. And in my mind, I used the sort of the tenets of Martin Luther King, which I also gave you for the handouts, which is basically like you have to sacrifice and show up to make social change. And I thought, okay, I'm going to come here and I'm going to carry her every time she needs to be carried, which, by the way, was very lucky for me that I could do that, that I'm not in a job, that it was possible for me to do that, and that is not possible for most people, or for many people. So I just thought, I'm going to do it. and they're going to realize that this is not okay.
You told me earlier that one of the reasons you did it was as an example and to represent for all the
Yes.
many parents that could not do it.
Absolutely. It's why I sometimes have taken harder paths, not for my daughter, but for myself, because I feel like inclusion and accessibility is such an afterthought a lot of the time in the New York City schools.
Absolutely.
That I have the power and I have the privilege that some people don't have in society. And I use that in an honorable way, and also in as like a, social economic way, that I can be home and do things and make calls and make change. And I feel like I have a responsibility to do that.
Well, and I think you've succeeded, I really do, because the fact that there was an investigation into the New York City school system to determine how accessible it really was, the fact that there's a report, the fact that this is still ongoing to investigate the level of
It's still an
accessibility
open investigation.
in every school. I find that amazing, and I'm sure that some of you are wondering what we're talking about. If you open your digital packet later, you're going to see articles, you're going to see the report, you're going to see every single thing we're talking about. I think it's a pretty remarkable story.
Thank you.
Now, half of our presentation is about school. As we put in our title, what do you do when your child's needs don't fit the organized mold of special and general education choices as presented by the school system? That is the question of the hour. So let's talk a little about choosing a school.
Well, we have said already, don't be limited
Don't be
by what the
limited.
DOE tells you. You
That's
should be
the
limited
phrase of the
by.
day. Don't be
Don't be
limited.
limited.
Okay.
I will say that it is, there is, if you're looking for the office you call that helps you place a child with unique needs, there is no number. There is no office. It doesn't exist, which is good and bad. So I would say the terrible part about that is that it would be good. It would be a good thing to have someone to guide you through this process. When you're going through the turning 5 and you have a child that maybe, like, it's not ADHD, it's not, something that they're familiar with, that they know the supports, they know the needs, they know this class and they know this school. It would be great to have somebody guide you, but they're not going to. So you have to become the guide. And you have to become the one who is in charge of the choice process. And it's work, but it's really important, valuable work. I would say the first thing you need to do is check out your zone school. And beyond that, look at every single option. Shake the box of schools upside down till the last cracker falls out. Go to their tours that they have, but also contact the schools, importantly, that you become interested in, and say, here's who we are, here's what our needs are, I need to talk to you about this, do you have time for me? And start a conversation with those schools. Because that conversation is going to tell you so much about what is possible there and how they're going to interact with you over the next X number of years.
Sure.
How they can support or they won't support you.
Sure.
And I would also say you don't have to know specifically what your child needs in the classroom for every single thing, but you need to have a pretty good picture. You need to know that if you have a child with unique needs, then they're going to be unique to the people in that school as well.
Right.
So you're going to have to be aware of what you think you need and start that conversation before you choose a school. If you start it
Sure.
after you choose a school, it may be too late.
It may be. Are you following this advice now, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly. So, our specific story is such that, our son was recommended for a self-contained classroom for his very first CPSE IEP meeting.
For preschool.
For preschool. And we knew nothing really. He was diagnosed the same week that we had that meeting. We really hadn't done any research around anything. And we never really, now in retrospect, we know a lot about like how IEPs are so much about advocacy. But we went in and kind of just listened to what they suggested, took it, and that's what it was. Looked I mean, and interestingly, this was in November, so classes were already full. There was one school with one opening, and we took it because what we thought was the important thing was this like 6 or 8 to 1 to 2 that they gave us. We thought that that's
Right,
what
small
made
ratio.
his education, based on really not knowing much of anything. So we took it. It turned out to really not work for my son. It turns out that even though he has a lot of needs that need to be met with a lot of therapies, he really needed a classroom with gen ed peers as well as other kids with disabilities as well. So it's a very long story, but we did end up in an integrated co-teaching classroom for pre-K, and it's been wonderful.
How long did it take you to realize that?
Not very long.
Amazing.
He just, it wasn't working for him. He's very social. His receptive language is very, very good. He needs to be around
Right.
peers that model communication in a way that as lovely as the kids in his class were, he wasn't getting what he needs for his growth. And they were not able to see that. What they saw in the IEP meeting was a kid who doesn't talk.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. And again, my son has, and I think speaking to Rebecca's point, my son has an extraordinarily rare diagnosis that presents in extraordinarily rare ways. And we have found that it's both a blessing and a curse because we're the experts. People look at my son, they see his label, they don't know what to do with it. And so we get to kind of explain it. And in a way, it's, a lot of assumptions are made because of how he presents, but in another way we get to debunk a lot of myths about him. And then integration has worked wonderfully for him right now. But speaking to Rebecca's point, I mean, we are not limiting ourselves in terms of, we won't make that mistake again. We won't say, oh, because integration has worked well now, that's what's going to work well in the future, because what's important to us is inclusion. Inclusion is important to us. And I have found in my journey of looking at various schools that inclusion sometimes is great in classes that have gen ed peers as well, and sometimes it looks better in classes that are self-contained and only have children who have disabilities or IEPs in them. Because inclusion is about your kid being included in all sorts of ways and making sure that they are not just the special kid in the class, that accommodations aren't made
Right.
for them, that while the rest of the class is learning. And so for us,
Or the special class in the school either.
correct,
Right?
That's one of the most important things to us. We really want our son to be a part of his school community. And so we are looking for the school and the environment that's going to work best for him, and we want to focus less on what the 8 to 1 to 2
model,
or the right, because we find that that's not
It's not a be-all, end-all.
it's not a be all end all.
It really isn't. And
That's the point.
Right.
There is no one be all end all. So you're constantly evaluating, balancing, analyzing. I mean, that's really what your job is for your child, because realistically, and we can talk a lot about interacting with teachers too, but a teacher has, well, it depends on your school, but it can anywhere from 25 to 30 children in their classroom.
Right.
And so my daughter's elementary school has 1,400 kids that those administrators were responsible for. Nobody's going to look at this process as closely and with as fine-tooth a comb as you as a parent are going to look at it.
right.
And nobody with the child with unique needs, like you said, is going to understand them as well as you probably will. You're going to have to be communicating constantly about that balance and explaining that balance to people all the time when you're looking for schools and then when you're in the school. And, as an example, a social inclusion issue for my daughter is that she uses an elevator when the rest of her middle school right now does not use an elevator. So what does that mean for her socially? Those interstitial, those 4 to 5 minutes they go from class to class is a huge social period for the children.
And people don't think of that.
And people don't think of that. Or they don't think about how does that affect how she gets, if she goes to the bus first because she has to take
Right.
the elevator and go with someone with the key for the elevator, how does that affect who she sits with? and how her partnerships happen on that bus, which affects how that entire field trip goes for her. Like when you let her go, who you let her go with, who's allowed in the elevator, how much time, and I tend to communicate things like this, so I roll it back and explain the timing between classes is set up this way for these reasons, but also because she's might be late, right? How does that affect her? And I'm like, it is not set up for a child for a wheelchair. Those 4 minutes hasn't been built around a child with a. So we're starting already with a system that has been built not with her in mind.
Right.
I always try and remind educators where we're starting, because that's not how I wish they could think about every kid like that all the time, but it's not practical. That is not what's going to happen. The more kids that are in their school that are different and unique, the more they're going to become aware of thinking in that way. But it's just almost so our job is to be the ones who are keeping an eye on all this and constantly communicating it and putting it in context for the people that are around in the schools with them.
It's really interesting, and it's kind of a skillful way to let the school off the hook to a certain extent and say, this was built long before you came. This is the environment. This is what has been built. And it's challenging to make these changes and be this aware of what needs to be done. Right, but once you've done it for one, you can do it for two. And before you know it, it becomes a practice. Now, I have an interesting question for you. Up until now, I can see that you've been doing 99.9% of the advocacy, but your daughter's getting older. Do you see her taking over that role as she gets a little older?
I do. And I plan for it. And I'm grooming her. And her approach to, and also she is and she isn't. And I should say that, I have to accept that her vision of what is the right amount of advocacy may be different than mine, or how she advocates may be different than mine. And that is part of, and that any child's independence involves that. But this is an area where it's like it's hard, right? Because you know what you want, you know what your kids need, so I've been working on her self-advocacy since she was a child. At the same time, a younger child, but at the same time, you can't just lay all this on your kid, because I feel like if she knew the degree to which things have to be arranged and fought for and
it's
asked
overwhelming.
for, it's overwhelming.
Yes.
It's too, and developmentally, it's too much. Like, what does that say to a child? And like, I know how heartbreaking it is for me at times to think about what she's faced with, and to deal with it. Like, I can't. It's not something you just give to them. You have to do it in incremental phases.
Right, but
it's happening.
Don't you think sooner or later she's going to come to you and say, Mom, there's something I'm upset about. I'm unhappy about the way this is going. And you might just respond and say, well, how could we make it better? What are your ideas? And she might have an idea.
Yeah.
You already do that.
Yes.
And then the next step is, who can we speak to about that? Would you like to do that? It's just one thing, and it might be manageable.
She's starting to do that. I was very proud of her last year. The 5th grade field day, which was, and I have to say, my daughter has always been in physical education, in the regular physical education class, because physical education is not about physical therapy. It's about being part of the team, being part of your friends, being part of the activity. And her elementary school did a wonderful job, including her middle school's doing a good job now too. And it takes a lot of dialogue, communication, letting people know, hey, you can do it, and helping them come up with ideas. But so I was proud of her because there was all the 5th grade, they figured out some accessible stuff and worked it out with her ahead of time. Like, it's also about the process. So we often teach this. My big thing is at schools, like, what's the process for including Jacqueline? And nowadays it is, have a conversation with Jacqueline, right? It's not about having it just like, you start with her. So they had a tug of war on field day that was standing up, and Jacqueline saw it and knew that she could do it if she was sitting down. And she requested that the 5th grade tug of wars be done sitting down.
Oh, how exciting. And what was the response to that?
Absolutely, it was a yes, which thank goodness. Because she got to be successful the first time she asked for something. And I think that's important. I think it'll be important for her to find out that sometimes that's the reality of her life, is you're not going to get it sometimes because we're not all aware all the time. But it was successful. And, you know, she dealt with the fact that some boys complained that it was done a different way and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, she had that experience and it was responded to positively. She's in the process of doing an awareness campaign of posters in her school right now by herself. But she wanted to put up some awareness posters about how, the do's and don'ts of dealing with people with disabilities. So I see little glimmers.
Isn't
of
that
advocacy.
exciting?
Yeah.
Now, do you imagine your son doing all these things in 7 years? Wouldn't it be amazing?
It would be amazing. But he's so little. I mean, yeah, he's
I
just
could
so
never
little.
have imagined
Who
that.
could have imagined the incredible things that happen?
Yeah.
You know, I am curious because we talked before about how some schools simply have a more supportive, accessible, and inclusion atmosphere than others. What would you look for example? I know there's different accommodations, there's different modifications. Some people think a paraprofessional might be the answer. What would you look for that you would feel this looks supportive?
I think my starting point has been, and it's my orientation in general, is to really look at people's attitudes. So to really sit down, you know, go to the open houses and the general talks about the school that they give to everyone. And if you feel like that's a good starting place, and maybe even if you don't feel like it's a good starting place, do speak with the directors of the school or the, you know, parent teacher coordinators or whoever the appropriate point person is, because I have at this point spoken with many of those administrators, and the ones who have the attitude of yeah, that sounds like it's a, you know, maybe that's a challenge, but it's a challenge that we'll totally take on. And, you know, we're so, we're very open to that. And if we don't know how to support him in that way, we can look for resources or people to explain to us how to support them in that way, him in that way. And to be honest with you, there are some schools that are proponents of inclusion who have not, when we've sat down and talked with them individually, it turns out it doesn't appear that they would be as open to meeting our son's needs. So
the reputation is not all.
Correct.
Absolutely.
So I don't think that that, and you know, it has not yet been our experience, and we still have some investigating to do with our zone school, but you know, maybe your zone school might be an appropriate fit, even if it doesn't appear that way at first. You really do have to speak with them and sort of get their understanding. But like I said, you know, for us, it really starts with the attitude of the leadership in the school.
Right.
Because it's going to trickle down.
That is so true.
Yes. I totally agree with everything you just said. And I do think that one thing that I've found is new schools are usually so busy being a new school
Right.
that they don't have a lot of bandwidth.
Right.
So that's one thing I found. So I would put a little note of caution, like if there's this brand new lottery charter near you that sounds so awesome, just keep, you know, check it out by all means. Like we said, like there's no absolute right answer to anything that we're asking or talking about here. So maybe they're going to be the best inclusion school ever in the world, and they're there for that purpose. But just be aware of that, because getting school up and running is no small feat. Also, I find that for my daughter, being in a large elementary school was useful because they do have a little, like, you know, the money people get is the money people get in their budgets in New York City public schools, but you have more flexibility in maneuvering with that budget the larger the school is what I think. However, being in a small community school might have advantages that outweigh that for your child. So, like, again, you know, it just depends on the kid. But those are kind of things you look at, is like, how can they wield their resources? How can they, how much time do they have if they're a new school, or if it's a small community school, how do kids there get their PT, their OT, their para? How do they budget for that? Do they have an SLT, a school leadership team?
Right.
Are they not a school leader? Like, are they, a pros school? A pros school has more control over some things. A pro school is a school that has met some requirements and they can sort of control their own destiny a little more than a typical New York City public
Aha.
school.
Well, there's a lot to learn, isn't
Yes,
there?
I'm sorry. Am I giving way too much?
There's a lot
Yeah.
to learn. When we first spoke, Rebecca, you talked about creating your own community of knowledge. I love the way that sounds. What is it?
That is exactly what it says, which is basically your network of information that you can create for yourself, which is what I feel like I've done for my daughter, and for our family, and I basically have tried to find every resource available to me in every way I could, and keep it and juice
And keep
it,
it.
because there is no guide for us. And I would imagine that you feel the way I do. Like, I feel that way in terms of parenting. There's no guidebook for parenting a child with a neuromuscular disorder. Like, there just isn't. And there are so many differences. Similarities, but like slight tweaks that are different for her. So since day one of realizing this was our journey, I've just been trying to like grab anecdotal information, factual information, like file this little thing away for later, file that away for later. And that's sort of what I call my community of knowledge.
Now, you've been kind enough to provide us with a list, and that's in the digital handout. But I'm also interested, you mentioned that even if you think that an activity might not be for you, you'll go anyway, because that way you meet the players and
Yeah, absolutely.
it's a huge investment in time and energy.
It is a time investment. And it's a balance, right? Like there's also the idea of playing American Girl doll with your daughter,
Right.
right? So I'm not suggesting which my daughter, by the way, would say I do not do often
do
enough. But I could do it forever and it wouldn't be hard. But I think that you have to have a personal balance, but at the end of the day, having resources will save you a lot of time and hours down the road. Like if you know where to turn to and what to do. And I would say of all the things I gave you, I think the two most important things that I gave you was a link to the disability service facilitator, who's a new position in the public school system, and also a link to the list of the field centers,
There's
their
a lot of contact info.
contact information.
Now, there's a new law, correct?
Yes, there is a new law. It's a year old. I'm going to forget the name of it. It's a local law passed by the city council. The genesis of the law is maybe because of this investigation, but more likely I think it was already going to happen anyway. I'm not sure. But what it means is that there has been a disability service facilitator appointed for all city agencies, which, by the way, is useful beyond schools, right?
Of
Like
course.
it's good to know that there's one for every agency. In the DOE, that gentleman's name is Michael Castelblanco. I became aware of his appointment and his name. I had heard that it was happening, but because we called upon him for an issue in my daughter's school this year, not me, the principal, and it's someone who is there when issues come up.
Right. And you said this person is very helpful.
It is very helpful. So I think that that's a good name to have. Now there's one for the entire DOE. It's not one for each borough or one for
Right.
each district. There's one. But so far, probably now he'll be busy, now that I said that out loud. His phone started ringing.
Well, we're sure nobody's going to abuse that information, and they'll be using it appropriately.
Yeah.
We're certain of that.
Absolutely.
So let's look into the future for a moment. A lot has happened, not enough. What do you envision for the future, Nicole?
What do I envision, or what
How
is
would
my
you
dream?
like to see? Yes.
I really, what my dream is that every school in every community, I mean, and just speaking locally in New York City, would provide differentiation to all students regardless of whether they have an IEP or a disability or not. I think the power of inclusion is incredible for both kids who have disabilities and kids who don't. As Rebecca was saying, the more schools have the opportunity to differentiate for students of all abilities, the more it's going to be possible for them to be better at it. The more parents are going to be able to send their students to that school. I find it, I remember one, and I don't remember exactly where I heard this example, but again, very naive and new to this process. I remember hearing an example of a classroom where a student who had a lot of sensory needs wasn't fully included in a general education classroom, and they had to dim the lights in the classroom, and they had to use some kind of the teacher used a voice modifier so that her amplification wasn't so high, and how all the students really benefited from that. And not all the students, but there were certain kids in the class that started to have better behaviors because of it. So even the kids who didn't have this identified need benefited from an environment that was more sensory friendly. So that's one example of how powerful inclusion is, and how accessibility and inclusion really kind of bleed together. And I hope that the direction that we don't go in is further differentiation, because I think the road of only having places where kids who have certain needs go, the more divided and unaware and more ableist of a society we will become.
That's right, and it's very dated. It's extremely old-fashioned. It's very dated,
and it's the wrong direction to go in.
Absolutely.
What's your vision, Rebecca?
It's very similar. I could go on for hours about specific policy and administrative changes, but I think it is the same thing, that inclusion is the norm, and the norm that is followed consistently throughout all New York City schools, which means that they would be accessible, physically accessible, because that's a hard barrier. No matter what anyone wants to do, if you can't get children through doors of schools, you can't include them. But also that the teachers and administrators feel joy and pride and empowerment in their inclusion, and that they feel that it is supported financially and philosophically. Because I think that's everything. I think there's so many people in the New York City school system that are trying so hard to do the right thing, but I don't know that they know that they should, can, will be supported, can get what they need, and it requires resources and support.
I think that's terrific. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it so much. Alrighty. This video will be up on our website in future, so if there's somebody you know that's interested in accessibility, please let them know. Please join us again on the third Thursday of each month. We continue having these conversations on disability. Thank you, and all together now, you gotta show up. That's the
You
one
gotta
thing.
show up.
Show up, people.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.